Just as a reminder, we are recording.
I'm glad you weren't recording the hymn. You can tell I'm out of practice because I forget the soprano part. It was a long stretch, but we're here now. So, did the God of Abraham fight at the siege of Troy? You've heard a reading from the God of Abraham and a reading about the siege of Troy. Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. And here's how. Back in the days of my youth, a person couldn't get through high school without reading Homer's ancient epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I don't suppose things have changed all that much because those poems are so foundational to Western literature. Not to mention, they're also good subjects for blockbuster motion pictures. They don't always get made into good motion pictures, mind you, just big ones. And one of the biggest several years ago starred Brad Pitt and Orlando Bloom as complex and introspective new age guys with insecurities right along with their muscles. And that's a weird mix because male sensitivity was not a feature of Homer's time. The Greeks and Trojans were fighting over a woman after all, and the feud between Achilles and King Agamemnon also starts over who gets ownership, not love, mind you, but ownership of which female hostage. To the ancient Greeks, love between men was the love that counted. Women were not much more than property. In the movie, Hector, Achilles, and particularly the women are modern characters. Stories give us word pictures of the people telling the story. And this can get complicated. The Iliad tells a tale that supposedly took place more than 3,000 years ago, but it also shows us the people who were retelling the story hundreds of years later. And the movie, Troy, is really about our own time and social assumptions, not ancient Greece at all. The men, and particularly the independent women, would have seemed very strange in Homer's time. The Trojan War was supposed to have taken place about 1200 BC between united Greek city-states and Troy, a city in what's now called Turkey, but then was known as Asia Minor. The Iliad, the poem about the Trojan War, wasn't written down until hundreds of years after that war supposedly took place, about 850 BC at the earliest. And the events it describes all take place during the final year of a 10-year war. Now, we don't know exactly who Homer was or really whether he even existed. Some modern scholars doubt he ever lived, or that the Iliad was written down as early as tradition says it was. Parts of it do, however, give a good picture of Bronze Age warfare. The heroes spend almost as much time bashing one another with rocks as poking one another with swords. On the other hand, the classical Greek gods, who take such an active part in the story, didn't come along until the Iron Age, hundreds of years after Troy was supposed to have fallen. So whenever we think about Homer, the Iliad is a complex word picture of at least two different historical periods mixed together. But that didn't make it any less influential. Roman emperors claimed to be descended from the Trojans, and so did the medieval ruling families of France and England. The Iliad inspired medieval bards, including the greatest English poet, my favorite, Geoffrey Chaucer, and later William Shakespeare. From the Renaissance on, though, scholars began to doubt that the Trojan War ever even happened. And then in the middle of the 19th century, a brilliant but eccentric German financier named Heinrich Schliemann fell in love with the Iliad. He studied it for years and then traveled to Turkey to search for a place that matched the scenery the Iliad describes. He found a hill called Hisarlik, which was already being excavated by an English archaeologist named Frank Calvert. And Hisarlik is a good example of what's called a tell. It's a mound that develops when a lot of people live in the same place for a very long time. People throw out garbage and debris. They tear down buildings and build over the rubble. Sometimes a whole city gets burned or abandoned, then a new city gets built on top of the ruins. And when archaeologists dig into such a mound, they find layer upon layer of different cities or fortresses built one on top of another over the centuries. Now, Calvert had been working this particular tell for about 10 years, but Schliemann had something Calvert didn't have: money. They formed a partnership. Schliemann hired huge teams of diggers and they tore into the mound. And Schliemann guessed ancient Troy, or Ilium, would be right at the bottom. And he was partly right. His trenching teams dug up stone walls and impressive gold jewelry and headdresses, which he promptly claimed was treasure once owned by Troy's king, Priam. He became famous, and so did the site. And most scholars do now agree that Troy was a real place and Schliemann had found it. But to his dismay, and that of later archaeologists, they soon realized his enthusiastic digging and blasting had actually destroyed much of the real Troy. There were a total of 12 cities in that mound, one built on top of the ruins of another, and Troy's actual ruins were about halfway up. And by the time they realized the mistake, Schliemann's workers had dug up and thrown away much of the city's remains. Archaeologists have now learned to go slower and keep better track of what they're digging. Still, after a century and a half of studying Troy and other ancient Mideastern ruins, inscriptions, and texts, researchers do have a pretty good idea of what happened. In about 1200 BC, the city was called Wilusa. It was a trading center of the declining Hittite Empire. And it really did get attacked and burned by invaders from across the Aegean Sea, a land the Hittites called Achiawa. Centuries later, classical Greek language and literature expanded the story. Wilusa became Ilium, and the land of Achiawa became Achaia, the names that Homer uses. The main Achaean city was King Agamemnon's real capital, Mycenae, not far from present-day Athens. The destruction of Troy was an early wave in a chaotic tide that swept across the whole Middle East. For reasons historians still don't completely understand, the whole region suffered what's now called the Bronze Age collapse. And it was a social catastrophe as serious as the fall of Rome 1,500 years later. It might have been caused by drought or famine. Ancient sources, including the Bible, describe those things. Or Eastern Europe might have been invaded by people from even farther away. The picture is still cloudy. What we do know is that civilizations collapsed throughout Eastern Europe, and displaced warriors sailed off to invade lands farther down the Mediterranean coast. Troy was only the beginning. Egyptian scribes called the invaders the sea peoples, and they wrote, quote, "No land could stand before their arms or keep from being destroyed. The sea peoples laid their hands upon the land as far as the circuit of the earth," close quote. The sea peoples destroyed Troy, occupied Cyprus, all along the Mediterranean coast, and then they spread inland. They destroyed the Hittite Empire and built cities of their own. And in the Bible, those cities are given names: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, that's where Goliath comes from, and Gaza. Excavation in those places now turn up Mycenaean style pottery, which is quite different from the local cultures that were there before. Archaeology tells us the Hebrew nations of Judea and Israel rose up and consolidated in the power vacuum left by the destroyed Hittite Empire. And they fought the Sea Peoples bitterly, but they did not call them by that name. Instead, the Bible refers to them as, anybody? Philistines. The region is still named for them, Palestine. And that's how Mycenaean Greek culture came to the lands of the Bible. Meanwhile, Greece itself went through a 300-year dark age. Mycenaeans used a form of writing that looked a lot like Egyptian hieroglyphics and is now called Linear B. Mycenaean culture collapsed. Linear B was forgotten. Hundreds of years later, the Iliad and other Greek epics were written down in a whole different language, which we call Classical Greek, using letters based on the Phoenician alphabet, which is ironically from a land the Sea Peoples invaded. All across the Middle East, cultures have cross-pollinated this way for thousands of years. Religion does not create culture. Rather, religion reflects the culture it's rooted in, which is why our Christianity is very different from the forms of Christianity around, say, 300 AD. And neither culture nor religion develop in isolation. Both develop in dynamic relationship with other cultures and world events. Roman and pagan culture influenced the development of the Christian religion, and in the same way, Semitic culture in the ancient Near East, Mycenaean culture, and classical Greek culture all influenced Hebrew thought and scripture. One example from the Bible is the mighty warrior Samson from the book of Judges. Now that term, Judges, is a not very good translation of the Hebrew term for the tribal leaders who they say led the conquest of the promised land. Samson is an important character in Judges, but he's not really a leader at all. Mighty though he is, he's more of a lone warrior, rather like the Greek Hercules. He's fearless and immensely strong, but like Hercules, he's also quick-tempered and he makes a lot of mistakes. And biblical scholar James L. Kugel notes another way Samson is like Greek heroes. He's a fool for love. Hebrew heroes rarely get tricked by women, but Greek heroes often fall prey to devious women. Samson gets involved with a succession of women and finally, of course, meets his demise at the hands of Delilah. But the women he loves are not Hebrew in the Bible. They're Philistine. In other words, they're Mycenaean Greek. Samson's first wife weeps on his shoulder until he gives her the answer to a riddle on which he's made a big bet, and then she betrays him, telling his friends so that he loses the bet. And as we all know, Delilah destroys Samson's strength by cutting his hair and then turns him over to the Philistines. But in the end, blinded and humiliated, he gains Greek-style tragic redemption by destroying himself and the Philistines altogether. Samson is, Kugel tells us, the biblical hero most like the heroes of Greek myth. He's what Kugel calls a border story, a story told by one culture that gets taken over by a rival culture. He most likely started out as a Philistine folk tale and then got co-opted by the writers of the Bible. And in their version, he's no longer a Philistine, but a destroyer of Philistines, but he keeps his weakness for sneaky Philistine women. Now, this sneaky women piece is all over ancient myth, of course, and I totally agree that it does get old after a while. Doesn't take a long while either, but it is what it is. The Bible is an even more multi-layered mix of blended cultures than the Iliad is. Ancient oral tradition overlaid with the descriptions from hundreds of years later, when those older stories got put into writing. It's very complex. There's Mesopotamian influence in the creation and flood stories in Genesis. There's Mycenaean influence, like the Samson story, and there's also classical Greek influence from several hundred years later. It's no coincidence that Eve in the Adam and Eve story acts more like the Greek Pandora than like Hebrew women in the Bible, such as Judith, Ruth, and Deborah. Not based on Pandora, but a very similar dynamic to the story. To the Hebrews, God was, of course, called by the sacred name, the four letters, it's called the Tetragrammaton, YHWH in English, not to be spoken aloud. In English language Bibles, that term, YHWH, is always translated as the Lord. So when you read that in the Bible, that's where it came from. The Hebrews also used another word, which was not sacred, El. That's translated into English as God. In a column in Biblical Archaeology Review magazine, scholar Mary Joan Winleath notes that when the Lord is in warrior mode, he acts a great deal like gods and demigods from Greek myth, such as Achilles from this morning's reading, which is the reason I combined those two readings. Elite warriors got their pick from the spoils of war, including human beings. If denied their proper due, including captives, they had the right to be angry. Agamemnon is king, but Achilles is even higher, goddess born. He's the son of Thetis, a sea goddess. As one scholar puts it, when the hostage woman, Briseis, is taken from him, Achilles burns with what in Greek is called menis, quote, a special word for the terrifying wrath of gods, not mortals, close quote. The Lord does the same thing in the book of Joshua. He knocks down the walls of Jericho, but Hebrew leaders take booty that's supposed to go to the priests. Bad idea. So God allows them to be defeated in the next battle, and only after they stone the offenders to death does God help the Hebrews again. Victory comes from the Lord, so he is entitled to all the spoils. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, God says that includes the sacrifice of every living thing in Canaanite cities. If God doesn't receive his due, he reacts the same way Achilles does in the Iliad. In 1 Samuel, another example, Judea's King Saul fails to execute all his captives and their livestock, and the high priest Samuel informs Saul that he has sinned grievously and then kills the captured king himself. And because of Saul's disobedience, God deserts Saul, lets him go insane, and allows him to be killed. And that's how King David becomes Israel's king. And these are not isolated examples. If you find cultural cross-pollination all through the Bible. In the Iliad, when Achilles' best friend Patroclus gets killed, Achilles mourns by saying, "My dear companion has perished, Patroclus, whom I loved as much as my own life." And when King David's best friend Jonathan is killed, David mourns the same way. Jonathan lies slain, my brother in arms, Jonathan, your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. Just one more Bible verse that reflects the influence of classical Greek poetry. Now, this is not to say the Old Testament just comes from Greek myth. It's very much 1,000 years of Hebrew religious thought influenced by the cultural currents swirling about it. There was a time when women were seen as property. Slavery was universally accepted, and genocide was standard military strategy. To read the Bible as a handbook for our world without translation is to lose the real wonder and the real meaning. The Bible itself shows how the Israelites started out believing in multiple gods, but worshiping one national god referred to as El or the Tetragrammaton. That was standard practice across the ancient Near East. Israel's neighbors did the same thing. And the Bible itself documents how it took hundreds of years for the Hebrews to stop following other gods, including the Lord's wife, the goddess Asherah, who was one of those other gods. The book of 2 Kings tells how about 622 BC, Judea's King Josiah had the wooden image of Asherah removed from Jerusalem's temple, burned, and its ashes scattered. So the movement toward monotheism was still in process 400 years after King David. Just saying. New sections got added, older sections were refined, multiple layers of myth, history, and religious reflection. Even more than the Iliad, the Bible is a fascinating text with deep insight into human nature and the human condition. But anyone who takes either one as some kind of black and white rule book for how to live in our time badly needs to look deeper, because they're missing the point. Another point for us today is how the Bible story reflects human affairs through the history over the 1,000 years it was being written down, more than 1,000 years. Without the Bronze Age collapse, the nation of Israel might never have arisen. The Bible might never have been written at all. The Hittite Empire did collapse and give way to the Assyrians. Babylon collapsed and was conquered by Persia. Egypt of the Pharaohs was eventually conquered by Alexander the Great and became Egypt of the Ptolemies. No human culture is forever. Civilizations do rise and fall. Dark ages do give rise to new enlightenment. And that might be the most important lesson for our tumultuous times. Religion is not one pure truth. It's not a simple set of instructions. Rather, religion is a set of principles which can carry us through good times and bad. We most need the steadying hand of high principle when times do seem most difficult. So may ours be a religion which carries us through times that try our souls. Times are not always good. In trying times, we need to be strongest in our determination toward good. Amen. May it be so.
Thank you, RJ. Today, we will try returning to our circle, for our time to voice our joys and concerns, though without the hand holding. Aware of our desire to connect and include our friends at home, we will be passing a microphone when you wish to speak. So just give a little wave when you feel, and I'll bring you a mic. Those at home can continue to raise your hand and we'll call on you. So please unmute yourself to share. So just to let you know, we will be able to see you at home on our TV screens, but you won't be able to see us. You should be able to hear us though. Okay, so let's go ahead and gather up.